Imagine a land where freedom and oppression existed side by side, where the same people who declared all men are created equal also enslaved millions. Picture a nation born in contradiction, yet daring to believe that ordinary people could govern themselves. From rebellion to civil war, from marches for justice to the voices of the unheard. This is the story of America raw, powerful, and unfinished. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes we're uncovering the real history of the United States, the struggles, the courage, and the ideals that shaped the nation we know today. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the beginning, before there was a flag or a promise, there was a land, vast, ancient, and alive with meaning. Long before the word America was ever spoken, native nations lived here for thousands of years, built civilizations, telling stories to the stars, and understanding that the earth was not owned, but shared. Their presence is the first chapter of this story, and it is a chapter too often whispered when it should be spoken aloud. Then came the ships, cutting across the Atlantic with sails full of hope, fear, faith, and ambition. Europeans arrived carrying dreams of freedom and fortunes, and they also carried conquest, disease, and domination. From the very start, America was born in contradiction, liberty spoken in the same breath as oppression. Faith proclaimed alongside violence. Jamestown survived by desperation, Plymouth by belief. And slowly, unevenly, a new society took shape. By the 18th century, 13 colonies stood at the edge of something unprecedented. These were people who read ancient philosophers by candlelight and began to believe. That power did not come from kings, but from the consent of the governed. In 1776, with the world watching, they declared an idea so dangerous it could get them all hanged, that all men are created equal. It was a radical promise, imperfectly understood and unevenly applied, but powerful enough to change history. The American Revolution was not just a war. It was a gamble on human self-rule. Yet, even as freedom was declared, millions were enslaved. The New Republic wrote soaring words about liberty while chaining human beings in fields and markets. This was not a footnote. It was a central wound. And from that wound came a long struggle between the nation America said it was and the nation it actually was. The Constitution that followed was an act of faith and faith in reason, fear of chaos. It balanced power against power, ambition against ambition, and trusted that future generations would bend it toward justice. It was not perfect, but it was alive, capable of growth, if the people were brave enough to demand it. As the nation expanded westward, it told itself a story of destiny. Railroads crossed plains, cities rose, and immigrants poured in Irish, German, Chinese, Italian, each carrying a piece of the old world into the new. But this expansion came at a devastating cost. Native peoples were driven from their lands. Treaties were broken. Tears marked the roads west. Progress once again came paired with pain. Then came the Civil War, the Great Reckoning. Brother against brother, 1 million dead. The question at the heart of the conflict was simple and terrible. Could a nation built on freedom survive half free and half enslaved? Abraham Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom, understanding that America could not move forward without confronting its deepest sin. Emancipation was not the end of the struggle, but it was a moral turning point, paid for in blood. The years that followed brought industrial might and staggering inequality. Steel and oil built empires. Workers labored in darkness while fortunes soared. Reformers rose. Women demanded the vote. Laborers demanded dignity. America's story, again and again, became one of ordinary people pushing the nation closer to its ideals. The 20th century tested the Republic. On a global scale, 2 world wars pulled the United States onto the world stage, not as a conqueror alone, but as a reluctant leader. In the Great Depression, the nation learned that unchecked power, whether political or economic, could devastate lives. In response, Americans chose community over collapse, action over despair. Yet freedom at home remained incomplete. African Americans, veterans of foreign wars, returned to segregation and silence. But they did not stay silent. From Montgomery to Memphis, from lunch counters to courthouse steps, the civil rights movement forced America to look in the mirror. With courage and sacrifice, citizens demanded that the promises written centuries earlier finally be honored. Change came slowly, but it came because people made it come. In recent decades, America has faced new challenges: terrorism and fear, technological evolutions, political division, and questions about truth itself. The nation has stumbled. It has argued loudly. It has doubted its own story. And yet, through every crisis, the same question returns: will we live up to the ideals we inherited? The history of the United States is not a straight line of triumph. It is a long, uneven journey, a nation constantly becoming, never finished. Its greatness has never come from claiming perfection, but from the willingness to confront failure and try again. America is not just a place on a map. It is an argument, renewed by each generation, about freedom, responsibility, and the dignity of the human soul. And the story is still being written by those who believe that the past is not a burden, but a guide, that democracy is not guaranteed, but earned, and that the promise of America fragile and luminous is worth the struggle to keep alive. From its first breath, America carried two opposing truths in the same body. The language of freedom arrived hand in hand with the machinery of domination, and neither ever fully released its grip. The nation did not begin as a clean moral experiment, but as a collision of ideals and interests, hope and harm. To understand the United States honestly is to accept that its founding was not a single shining moment, but a tangled human drama in which noble words and brutal actions shared the same page. The earliest European arrivals spoke of liberty in religious and economic terms, fleeing persecution or seeking opportunity, imagining a place where they might be unburdened by distant crowns and rigid hierarchies. Yet the land they claimed was not empty, and their freedom was built upon the dispossession of others. Native peoples were not obstacles to progress. They were nations with memory, law, and belonging. Still, expansion required erasure. And so the rhetoric of destiny grew louder as the reality of conquest grew harsher. The contradiction was already set. Freedom for some required the unfreedom of others. This pattern hardened with the rise of slavery, which became not a side effect, but a foundation of colonial prosperity. Enslaved Africans were forced into labor systems that powered agriculture, trade, and wealth. Even as the language of liberty grew more eloquent, the same generation that debated natural rights also measured human beings as property. This was not hypocrisy born of ignorance. Many knew exactly what they were doing. They simply chose comfort, profit, and fear over justice. The contradiction was not accidental. It was engineered, rationalized, and defended. When the revolutionary moment arrived, the tension sharpened rather than dissolved. The Declaration of Independence spoke in universal terms, appealing to humanity itself, asserting equality as a self-evident truth. Those words reverberated far beyond the colonies, lighting fires of imagination across the world. But inside the new nation, they landed unevenly. Women were excluded. Indigenous people were ignored. Enslaved people heard the promise and recognized its power, even as they were denied its protection. The words were true, but the practice was partial, and the gap between them would define the American experience. The founding generation understood that they were building something fragile. They distrusted concentrated power, having seen what unchecked authority could do. Yet many of them exercised absolute power over others in their private lives. The Constitution reflected this tension. It was a document of restraint and compromise designed to hold together competing interests long enough for the Republic to survive. Slavery was not named, but it was embedded, counted, protected, postponed. The founders hoped, some sincerely and others conveniently, That time would resolve what courage did not. As the nation expanded, the contradiction widened. The language of opportunity fueled migration and settlement, but expansion required land, and land was taken through force, fraud, and broken promises. Freedom was framed as movement, ownership, and growth, while the freedom of native nations was systematically dismantled. Removal was justified as necessity. Violence was softened by law. The Republic told itself stories that made the contradiction bearable, insisting that progress excused cruelty, that the future required sacrifice, and that those who suffered were simply on the wrong side of history. At the same time, the ideal of freedom continued to inspire resistance. Enslaved people ran, rebelled, prayed, organized, and remembered the words that claimed they were equal. Abolitionists, often marginalized and ridiculed, insisted that the nation confront itself. Women, denied political voice, argued that liberty without inclusion was an illusion. The contradiction became a pressure point, generating conflict but also movement. America's ideals were never static. They were tools seized by those who had been excluded and turned back on the system that denied them. Economic growth intensified the divide. Wealth accumulated rapidly while labor was exploitative, shortened, and communities fractured. The promise of upward mobility coexisted with grinding inequality. Freedom was celebrated as individual success, even as structural barriers made that success unreachable for many. The nation praised self-reliance while depending on invisible labor. This, too, was part of the founding contradiction of belief in equal opportunity within a system that produced unequal outcomes by design. Religion, often invoked as a moral compass, reflected the same tension. Faith inspired movements for justice and mercy, yet it was also used to justify hierarchy and submission. Scripture was quoted in defense of slavery and later segregation, even as other voices drew from the same texts to demand liberation. Moral certainty did not resolve the contradiction, it often deepened it, giving divine sanction to human choices shaped by fear and interest. The Civil War exposed the contradiction in its most violent form. The question was no longer theoretical. A nation that claimed freedom could not indefinitely contain a system that denied it so completely. The war was not just about territory or politics. It was about the meaning of the founding promise. Emancipation struck at the heart of the contradiction, but it did not erase it. Freedom declared was not freedom secured. The end of slavery did not bring equality, only a new phase of struggle over who counted and who decided. After the war, the country oscillated between progress and retreat. Amendments expanded citizenship and rights, while new laws and customs restricted them. The promise grew broader in theory and narrower in practice. Each advance provoked resistance. Each assertion of equality was met with efforts to preserve hierarchy. The contradiction proved resilient, adapting to new language and new systems without disappearing. In the modern era, the same pattern persisted. America presented itself as a champion of freedom abroad while wrestling with injustice at home. Democratic ideals were exported, even as they were contested internally. Movements for civil rights, labor protections, and gender equality did not introduce new values. They demanded consistency. They asked the nation to align its actions with its words to reduce the distance between what it said it believed and what it was willing to enforce. The endurance of this contradiction does not mean the ideals were hollow. It means they were powerful enough to survive misuse and strong enough to challenge the structures that betrayed them. Freedom was never a settled fact. It was a contested space. The nation's identity formed not around perfection, but around argument, conflict, and the uneasy coexistence of aspiration and reality. The story of America begins not with harmony, but with tension, a tension that shaped every institution, every debate, every generation, binding the promise of liberty to the persistent struggle over who would be allowed to share in it. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves was once considered reckless, even dangerous, a notion that defied centuries of inherited authority and divine right. For most of human history, power flowed downward from kings, emperors, and nobles who claimed legitimacy through bloodlines, conquest, or God. Stability was believed to depend on hierarchy, obedience, and tradition. Against this backdrop, the American experiment emerged not merely as a new nation, but as a profound challenge to how power itself was understood. In the colonies, self-government did not begin as a grand philosophical statement, but as a practical necessity. Distance from Europe forced local decision-making. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and elected councils grew out of daily needs rather than revolutionary intent. Over time, these habits shaped expectations. People who voted on taxes and laws in their communities began to believe that. Their voices mattered, that authority could be negotiated rather than imposed. What started as routine participation quietly reshaped political consciousness. Ideas from the Enlightenment gave language to these experiences. Thinkers argued that human beings possessed natural rights, that governments existed to protect those rights, and that legitimacy arose from consent rather than coercion. These were abstract arguments, debated in books and salons, but in America they collided with lived experience. Colonists who already practiced a degree of self-rule found in these ideas a justification for what they had come to value. Theory and habit reinforced each other, transforming dissatisfaction into conviction. The break with monarchy was not inevitable. Many colonists still saw themselves as loyal subjects seeking reform, not rebellion. What pushed them toward revolution was the growing belief that power exercised without consent was not merely unfair, but illegitimate. Taxes imposed from afar, laws passed without representation, and troops stationed without approval all became symbols of a deeper grievance. The issue was not just policy, it was principle. Who had the right to rule and why? Declaring independence required a leap of faith. To assert that people could choose their own leaders and design their own institution was to reject the assumption that order required inherited authority. It was to trust that human reason, debate, and compromise could replace command. This faith was fragile, tested by fear of chaos, faction, and failure. Even supporters of independence worried that self-government might collapse into disorder, that ambition and passion would tear the experiment apart. The creation of a republic demanded constant balancing. Power had to be strong enough to govern, but restrained enough to avoid tyranny. The solution was not a single leader or institution, but a system of shared authority, checks and balances, and divided responsibilities. This structure reflected deep skepticism about human nature. Self-government did not assume that people were always wise or virtuous. It assumed they were fallible and designed mechanisms to limit the damage of that fallibility. Voting became both a symbol and a practice of this new order. The act of casting a ballot transformed subjects into citizens, participants rather than spectators. Yet voting was limited, shaped by fears about who could be trusted with power. Property requirements, racial exclusion, and gender barriers narrowed the circle of self-rule. Even so, the principle was established, authority flowed upward. The exclusions revealed the tension between belief and application, but the belief itself remained radical. The success of the early republic was uncertain. Economic instability, regional rivalries, and political factions threatened to fracture the nation. Critics abroad predicted failure, convinced that a government without a king could not endure. Each peaceful transfer of power became a quiet revolution, reinforcing the idea that leadership could change without violence. Over time, these moments accumulated, building trust in a system that depended not on force, but on shared acceptance of rules. Self-government required more than institutions. It required culture. Citizens had to learn habits of participation, compromise, and restraint. Democracy demanded patience, tolerance, and a willingness to lose and try again. These were not natural instincts. They had to be taught, practiced, and defended. Newspapers, public speeches, and civic organizations became arenas where the meaning of self-rule was debated and refined. As the nation expanded, The idea of self-government traveled with it, sometimes as aspiration, sometimes as justification. Settlers claimed the right to govern themselves, even as they denied that right to others. Territories sought statehood, demanding representation and autonomy. At the same time, indigenous nations were excluded from the promise, treated as obstacles rather than participants. The radical idea of popular sovereignty was unevenly applied, powerful in its appeal, but limited in its reach. Moments of crisis tested the strength of the belief. Civil war, economic collapse, and social upheaval forced Americans to reconsider whether self-government could survive extreme strain. Each time, the answer depended on collective action rather than decree. Amendments expanded participation. Movements organized to demand inclusion. The boundaries of the political community shifted, often slowly and contested. But guided by the underlying conviction that legitimacy came from the people, the idea continued to evolve. Industrialization and urbanization complicated the relationship between citizens and power. Large institutions, both public and private, challenged individual influence. In response, reformers sought new ways to make government accountable, introducing regulations, transparency, and expanded suffrage. Self-government was no longer just about voting. It was about shaping systems that affected daily life. Globally, the American model became both inspiration and provocation. Other nations watched, borrowed, adapted, and sometimes rejected its example. The claim that people could govern themselves without descending into chaos unsettled empires and energized reformers. The idea traveled beyond borders, detached from its original context, proving that its power lay not in geography, but in possibility. At home, the meaning of self-government remained contested. Debates over federal versus local authority, majority rule versus minority rights, and liberty versus security revealed ongoing uncertainty about how popular power should operate. These arguments were not signs of failure, but evidence of engagement. Self-government was not a finished system, but a process requiring constant negotiation. The radical nature of the idea lay not only in its rejection of kings, but in its demand for responsibility. If the people were sovereign, they could not blame distant rulers for their condition. Success, failure belonged to them collectively. This burden was heavy, requiring attention, participation, and moral judgment. The experiment assumed that citizens would care enough to argue, vote, protest, and serve. Over time, cynicism and apathy posed threats as serious as external enemies. When belief in self-rule weakened, institutions hollowed out. Each generation faced the task of renewing commitment, of explaining again why shared power mattered and how it could be preserved. The radical idea survived not because it was easy, but because it adapted, challenged, and demanded engagement from those who inherited it. Self-government was never meant to guarantee harmony. It was designed to channel conflict into peaceful forums, to replace violence with debate and authority with accountability. Its endurance depended on trust in processes rather than personalities, on faith that disagreement could coexist with unity. The idea asked people to believe that collective decision-making, however flawed, was preferable to imposed order, and that freedom was not the absence of rules, but the right to shape them together. Slavery was not a peripheral contradiction in the American story. It was a central force that shaped the nation's economy, politics, and moral imagination. From the earliest days of the colonies, the enslavement of African people became woven into daily life, transforming human beings into commodities and labor into coerced suffering. This system did not grow in the shadows. It was visible, defended, regulated, and normalized, even as the language of liberty grew louder and more confident. The roots of slavery in America lay in a global network of trade and exploitation. Ships crossed oceans, carrying captive men, women, and children torn from their homes and histories. Their arrival marked not just the beginning of forced labor, but the deliberate construction of racial hierarchy. Laws were written to define people as property, to make bondage hereditary, and to strip away legal personhood. Slavery became self-perpetuating, sustained by fear, profit, and the gradual hardening of cruelty into routine. As plantations expanded, wealth accumulated, entire regional economies came to depend on enslaved labor. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar tied American prosperity to human bondage, creating incentives that reached far beyond the fields. Merchants, financiers, insurers, and politicians all benefited, binding the nation to slavery through shared interests. Moral discomfort was softened by distance, denial, and ideology. Enslaved people were dehumanized in language and law to make exploitation appear natural and inevitable. Yet within this system, resistance never ceased. Enslaved individuals preserved culture, memory, and dignity under conditions designed to erase them. They resisted through flight, rebellion, sabotage, faith, and quiet endurance. Families were formed and reformed despite forced separation. Stories and songs carried hope across generations. The persistence of humanity under inhuman conditions became a living indictment of the system itself. Opposition to slavery grew slowly and unevenly. Early critics framed their objections in religious terms, arguing that bondage violated divine law. Others appealed to reason, insisting that slavery corrupted both the enslaved and the enslaver. These voices were often marginalized, attacked, or silenced. Still, they planted seeds. Pamphlets circulated. Meetings convened. Moral arguments sharpened. The nation began to confront a question it could not permanently avoid. The contradiction between slavery and the ideals of freedom strained political structures. Compromises attempted to contain the conflict without resolving it. New territories raised old questions. Each expansion westward reopened debates over whether slavery would spread or be contained. These compromises postponed reckoning but deepened division, turning moral disagreement into sectional identity. Slavery became not just an institution, but a defining line between competing visions of America. Enslaved people themselves forced the issue into public view. Escapes challenged the notion of contentment. Rebellions shattered illusions of control. Narratives written by those who had endured bondage exposed the brutality the defenders tried to sanitize. These accounts personalized injustice, making abstraction impossible. Readers were confronted with names, faces, and experiences that contradicted comforting myths. The Civil War emerged from this long moral and political struggle. It was the violent culmination of decades of avoidance and denial. The question at its core was whether a nation founded on liberty could survive while denying liberty to millions. The war demanded sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. Lives were lost not only on battlefields, but in homes and communities fractured by grief. The cost of maintaining the contradiction had become unbearable. Emancipation marked a profound shift. The legal destruction of slavery altered the nation's moral landscape, but it did not erase the legacy of bondage. Freedom arrived unevenly, often without protection or resources. Formerly enslaved people faced hostility, poverty, and violence even as they sought to build new lives. The promise of equality remained fragile, contested by those unwilling to relinquish power. Reconstruction offered a brief window of possibility. Constitutional amendments expanded citizenship and rights, attempting to redefine the nation on more inclusive terms. For a moment, democracy widened. Black Americans voted, held office, and participated openly in civic life. This progress provoked fierce resistance. Violence, intimidation, and legal maneuvering dismantled gains, replacing slavery with new systems of control. Segregation and discrimination became tools to preserve hierarchy without chains. Laws enforced separation. Customs reinforced exclusion. Economic opportunity remained restricted. The moral struggle shifted forms, but did not disappear. The nation told itself that the past was resolved even as inequality persisted. Memory was reshaped to minimize guilt, and normalize injustice. The descendants of enslaved people continued to press the nation toward its ideals. Through education, activism, and community building, they challenged narratives that denied their humanity. The civil rights movement revived the moral urgency of earlier struggles, connecting contemporary injustice to the unfinished work of emancipation. Appeals to conscience, law, and history converged, forcing the country to confront what it had postponed. Slavery's legacy extended beyond race relations into the structure of American life. Wealth gaps, residential patterns, educational disparities, and political power all bore its imprint. The past was not distant, it was present, embedded in institutions and assumptions. Understanding this reality required honesty about causation and responsibility, not as an exercise in blame, but as a prerequisite for justice. The moral struggle over slavery reshaped American identity. It revealed the capacity for cruelty and courage, denial and sacrifice. It exposed the cost of compromising principles for comfort. It demonstrated that ideals, once spoken, create obligations that cannot be permanently ignored. The nation learned that injustice left unaddressed would demand payment, whether through conflict, reform, or continued division. Remembering slavery honestly means recognizing both suffering and resistance. It means acknowledging the choices that sustained the system and the efforts that dismantled it. The struggle was not abstract. It was lived in bodies, families, and communities. The consequences did not end with abolition. They carried forward, shaping debates about citizenship, equality, and belonging. The American moral narrative cannot be separated from this history. Slavery tested the nation's claims and revealed their limits. The fight again, it expanded the meaning of freedom and exposed the work required to defend it. Each generation inherited not only the benefits of earlier struggles, but the responsibility to address unfinished business bound by the understanding that liberty denied anywhere weakened. Liberty everywhere, slavery and injustice were not temporary detours in the American journey. They were embedded realities that shaped the nation's deepest moral struggle from its earliest days. The forced labor of enslaved Africans was not merely tolerated, but protected by law, defended by custom, and justified by ideology. From the moment slavery took root, it forced America into a sustained conflict between its declared belief in human equality and its practiced denial of that belief. This struggle was not abstract or distant. It unfolded in homes, fields, courts, churches, and legislatures, shaping how Americans understood power, race, and worth. The system of slavery transformed people into instruments of profit, reducing lives to labor and families to assets. Laws codified this reduction, defining enslaved human beings as property while granting absolute authority to owners. Violence was not incidental, it was essential. Whips, chains, and terror enforced compliance, while legal structures ensured permanence. Children inherited bondage at birth, binding generations to a fate they did not choose. Slavery's cruelty lay not only in physical suffering, but in its attempt to erase identity, agency, and future. Yet, even under such conditions, enslaved people asserted their humanity. They formed families despite the constant threat of separation. They created spiritual traditions that affirmed dignity when the world denied it. They resisted openly and quietly through rebellion and refusal, escape, and endurance. Every act of survival challenged the lie that slavery was natural or benign. Their existence exposed the moral contradiction at the heart of the nation, making it impossible to claim innocence. As the Republic developed, slavery grew alongside it, entangled with economic expansion and political power. Southern wealth depended heavily on enslaved labor, while Northern industry profited indirectly through trade, shipping, and finance. The institution was national, not regional, supported by compromises that prioritized unity over justice. Political leaders spoke cautiously, fearing that confronting slavery too directly would fracture the fragile Union. Delay became policy, and postponement masqueraded as prudence. These compromises shaped the nation's laws and institutions. The Constitution protected slavery without naming it, embedding inequality into the framework of governance. Representation was calculated to increase the power of slave-holding states while denying rights to the enslaved themselves. This arrangement deepened resentment and imbalance, tying national stability to human bondage. Each attempt to avoid conflict made eventual confrontation more likely. Opposition to slavery intensified as its contradictions became harder to ignore. Abolitionists challenged not only the institution, but the moral complacency that sustained it. Their voices disrupted public comfort, forcing uncomfortable questions into mainstream discourse. Enslaved people who escaped and told their stories transformed abstract debates into human testimony. These narratives stripped away romanticized visions of the past and replaced them with lived experience, confronting audiences with suffering they could no longer deny. The expansion of the nation intensified the struggle. New territories reopened the question of slavery's reach, turning geography into ideology. The debate was no longer just about labor systems, but about the future character of the Republic. Would freedom be expansive or selective? Would equality remain theoretical or become enforceable? These questions divided communities, parties, and families, turning moral disagreement into political crisis. The Civil War was the culmination of this unresolved struggle. It represented the collapse, a compromise, and the cost of avoidance. The war forced the nation to confront whether it could continue to exist while betraying its own ideals. Emancipation emerged not simply as a strategic decision, but as a moral necessity, redefining the purpose of the conflict. The abolition of slavery altered the nation's legal foundation, but it did not resolve the deeper struggle over equality. Freedom arrived burdened by resistance. The end of slavery exposed unresolved fears and hatreds, leading to new forms of control designed to preserve old hierarchies. Reconstruction promised transformation, briefly expanding democracy and redefining citizenship. At a time, formerly enslaved people participated openly in political life, shaping laws and institutions. This progress provoked violent backlash, revealing how deeply injustice was rooted in social and economic structures. The retreat from Reconstruction marked a turning point. Segregation replaced slavery as the dominant system of racial control. Discrimination became normalized through law and custom, reinforcing inequality without the explicit language of ownership. The nation moved forward materially while remaining divided morally. Public memory softened the brutality of slavery, reframing it as a regrettable but distant chapter rather than a living influence. Despite this retreat, the moral struggle continued. Black Americans built institutions, educated generations, and challenged exclusion through persistent effort. Legal battles, protests, and cultural expression kept the promise of equality alive when the state failed to enforce it. The civil rights movement drew directly from the unresolved legacy of slavery, insisting that emancipation without equality was incomplete. This struggle forced the nation to confront its own history. Laws changed, barriers fell, opportunities expanded, but the legacy of slavery remained. Embedded in wealth distribution, housing patterns, education, and health. These disparities were not accidents, they were consequences. Addressing them required acknowledging the past as a shaping force rather than a closed chapter. The moral weight of slavery extended beyond policy into identity. It shaped how Americans understood race, citizenship, and belonging. Myths developed to excuse injustice, portraying inequality as natural or deserved. Challenging these myths required sustained effort and moral clarity, often met with resistance from those invested in the status quo. The nation's struggle with slavery revealed a broader truth about democracy itself. Ideals alone were insufficient without enforcement. Rights declared but denied created instability rather than harmony. Justice postponed did not fade. It accumulated pressure. Each generation inherited both the progress made and the failures left behind. bound by decisions they did not make but were required to confront. Slavery's legacy demanded more than remembrance. It demanded responsibility. Understanding the depth of injustice required listening to voices long ignored and examining systems long accepted. The struggle was not solely about the past, but about the meaning of equality in the present. The nation's moral credibility depended on its willingness to face what slavery created and sustained, recognizing that freedom proclaimed without justice enforced remained incomplete, unresolved, and contested. Across time, the American story has never been driven only by presidents, generals, or lawmakers. Again and again, it has been reshaped by ordinary people who refuse to accept the limits placed before them. From farms and factories, churches and classrooms, streets and kitchens, citizens with little formal power have pushed the nation closer to the ideals it claimed to hold. Their names are often forgotten, but their actions altered laws, customs, and conscience, proving that democracy's deepest strength lies not in authority, but in participation. In the early republic, political life was restricted, yet ordinary citizens still found ways to influence their communities. Small farmers debated taxes and representation. Artisans organized to protect their livelihoods. Newspapers circulated arguments that extended far beyond elite circles. Participation in civic life became a habit, shaping expectations about accountability and voice. Even when excluded from formal power, people learned to organize, petition, and protest, laying the groundwork for broader movements. Enslaved people, denied legal standing, embodied this dynamic in its most extreme form. With no rights recognized by law, they nonetheless asserted moral authority through resistance and survival. Their acts of defiance challenged the legitimacy of the system itself. Escapes destabilized slave economies. Rebellions exposed fear beneath control. Cultural preservation asserted humanity where society denied it. Their struggle forced the nation to confront contradictions that laws alone could not resolve. Women, barred from voting in office, built influence through networks of reform. They organized against slavery, alcohol abuse, and poverty, linking moral arguments to public action. Their exclusion sharpened their critique, making the denial of political voice a central issue. Over decades, persistence transformed ridicule into recognition. Suffrage was not granted as a gift. It was claimed through marches, speeches, imprisonment, and sacrifice by individuals who refused to remain invisible. Workers played a similar role as industrialization transformed American life. Long hours, unsafe conditions, and meager wages provoked collective action. Labor unions emerged from shared hardship, demanding dignity in the workplace. Strikes and protests disrupted production, forcing employers and governments to respond. Progress came unevenly and often at great cost, but labor movements reshaped expectations about fairness, safety, and economic justice. Immigrants brought both vulnerability and resilience, facing discrimination and exploitation. They organized within their communities to protect one another. Mutual aid societies, religious institutions, and cultural organizations provided support where the state did not. Over time, these communities pressed for inclusion, reshaping the nation's understanding of identity and belonging. Their persistence expanded the definition of who could be American. The struggle for civil rights stands as one of the clearest examples of ordinary people transforming national ideals into lived reality. Students sat at lunch counters, workers boycotted buses, families endured threats and violence to claim basic rights. Leadership mattered, but movements were sustained by countless individuals whose courage rarely made headlines. Their collective action forced the nation to confront injustice that had long been normalized. These efforts relied on moral clarity and strategic patience. Nonviolent protest exposed brutality without mirroring it. Appeals to conscience connected personal suffering to national values. Legal challenges translated lived experience into institutional change. Progress was slow, resisted at every turn, but persistence reshaped laws and attitudes. The distance between promise and practice narrowed not through decree, but through demand. Ordinary citizens have also shaped America in quieter ways. Teachers expanded opportunity through education. Journalists exposed corruption. Artists challenged assumptions and broadened empathy. Local leaders built institutions that outlasted them. These contributions rarely fit into heroic narratives, yet they sustained democratic culture. The health of the republic depended on such daily acts of engagement. Moments of crisis revealed the importance of civic responsibility. Economic collapse prompted mutual support and reform. Wars mobilized communities as well as armies. Disasters exposed inequalities, while also inspiring solidarity. In each case, citizens responded not only as individuals, but as members of a shared project. Their actions demonstrated that national resilience was rooted in local commitment. Resistance was often met with backlash. Progress provoked fear among those who benefited from existing hierarchies. Activists faced imprisonment, violence, and social isolation. Gains were fragile, vulnerable to reversal. Yet setbacks did not erase achievements. Each movement left behind tools, language, and precedents that later generations could use. Change accumulated through persistence rather than permanence. The role of ordinary people also complicated national myths. It challenged the idea that history moved only through great men or inevitable forces. Instead, it revealed contingency, showing how individual choices shaped outcomes. Small acts, multiplied across communities, produced momentum. Democracy appeared not as a static system, but as a living practice requiring effort and renewal. Technology and communication altered the terrain of participation. Printing presses, radio, television, and digital platforms expanded reach and accelerated organization. Voices once confined to local spaces gained national audiences. This amplification increased both opportunity and conflict, intensifying debates over truth, responsibility, and influence. Still, the underlying dynamic remained the same: individuals asserting agency within collective structures. The persistence of ordinary citizens kept the nation's ideals from hardening into rhetoric. When promises were broken, people remembered them and demanded repair. When rights were denied, they insisted on inclusion. This insistence prevented democracy from becoming purely procedural. It infused institutions with moral purpose, reminding the nation that legitimacy required responsiveness. Each generation inherited both victories and unfinished work. Progress did not eliminate injustice, it shifted its forms. New challenges demanded new responses, but the pattern endured. Ordinary people organized, protested, voted, served, and sacrificed, expanding the boundaries of participation. Their actions affirmed that democracy was not a gift bestowed from above, but a responsibility assumed from below, sustained by the belief that collective effort could bring practice closer to principle. The American story has never been complete, nor sealed in the past or settled by any single generation. From the beginning, the nation existed as a work in progress, defined less by what it achieved than by what it aspired to become. Each era inherited a set of ideals along with unresolved contradictions, and each was forced to decide whether those ideals would remain words or become action. The sense of incompletion was not a weakness, but a condition of a democratic society that depended on renewal rather than finality. The founding documents themselves reflected this openness. They outlined principles, but left their full meaning to be argued, interpreted, and enforced over time. Equality, liberty, and justice were declared, not defined in exhaustive detail. This ambiguity created space for growth and contestation. It also allowed injustice to persist under the cover of interpretation. The unfinished nature of the project meant that progress required vigilance, not complacency. Expansion across the continent reinforced this sense of becoming. As the nation grew geographically, it confronted new moral and political questions. Each new state, territory, and community forced reconsideration of who belonged and under what terms. Decisions made in one generation reshaped the options available to the next. The past was never inert. It exerted pressure, demanding response. Moments of reform underscored the ongoing nature of the work. Abolition, suffrage, labor rights, and civil rights did not conclude debates, they transformed them. Each victory revealed new gaps between principle and practice. Rights gained in law required protection in life. Promises extended required enforcement and defense. The sense of progress coexisted with awareness of fragility. The unfinished story also shaped national identity. America defined itself not only by heritage, but by commitment to ideals that transcended origin. This allowed newcomers to claim belonging through participation rather than lineage. At the same time, it raised questions about obligation. If the nation was always becoming, then citizenship required engagement, not inheritance. Belonging carried responsibility. Crisis often exposed the cost of neglect. Wars, depressions, and social upheavals revealed how quickly assumptions could collapse. Each crisis tested whether institutions could adapt without abandoning core values. The outcomes were mixed. Sometimes fear narrowed vision. Other times, hardship inspired reform. The unfinished nature of the nation meant that no outcome was guaranteed, only possible. Generational change ensured that interpretation never stopped. Values were re-examined in light of new knowledge and experience. What once seemed settled became contested again. This process could be exhausting, producing frustration and division, yet it also prevented stagnation. The refusal to declare the story complete kept moral questions alive. Education played a central role in this renewal. Schools, universities, and informal learning transmitted both history and expectation. How the past was taught shaped what the future seemed to allow. Honest reckoning expanded possibility. Selective memory constrained it. The unfinished narrative demanded accurate understanding, not myth, as a foundation for progress. The sense of incompletion also complicated patriotism. Love of country was not simply celebration, but commitment. To care for an unfinished project meant acknowledging flaws while refusing despair. This form of loyalty required humility and effort. It rejected the comfort of final answers in favor of sustained work. Technology and globalization intensified the challenge. Rapid change outpaced existing frameworks, forcing constant adaptation. Economic shifts created new inequalities. Cultural exchange challenged assumptions about identity. The unfinished nation had to respond to forces beyond its control, while remaining accountable to its ideals. The pace of change made renewal more urgent and more difficult. Political conflict reflected competing visions of what completion might mean. Some sought stability through preservation. Others demanded transformation. These disagreements were not signs of collapse, but expressions of an ongoing argument about direction. Democracy thrived not on unanimity, but on managed disagreement. The idea of an unfinished story also reshaped responsibility for the future. Decisions were made with awareness of inheritance. Policies enacted today shape conditions tomorrow. Short-term gain threatened long-term principle. The absence of finality required foresight and restraint, qualities not always rewarded in political life. Marginalized voices often carried the strongest sense of incompletion. Exclusion sharpened awareness of unrealized promises. Those denied full participation understood most clearly that the story was not done. The demands expanded the horizon of possibility, insisting that completion meant inclusion rather than closure. The openness of the American project also created vulnerability. Without a fixed endpoint, progress could stall or reverse. Gains could be undone. Rights could be restricted. The unfinished nature of the story required constant defense. Freedom depended on memory, participation, and vigilance. This condition shaped how success was measured. Achievement was provisional. Institutions were judged not by permanence, but by adaptability. Justice was understood as a process rather than a state. This perspective resisted triumphalism, emphasizing continuity of effort over final victory. Awareness of incompletion placed moral weight on choice. Each generation faced decisions that could narrow or widen opportunity. There was no external guarantee that the nation would move toward justice. Outcomes depended on action and inaction alike. Responsibility could not be deferred. The American story persisted not because it reached an endpoint, but because it invited continuation. Its endurance lay in the willingness to revise, correct, and recommit. The absence of finality meant that hope and risk coexisted, bound together by the understanding that the future remained open, shaped by those who accepted the burden of carrying the story forward. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.